It started as a signal that no one was expecting. At first it was barely noticeable, a faint pattern buried deep in the streams of data that scientists and technicians monitored every day. Satellite stations around the world were constantly scanning the skies and deep space for signals, but most of what they detected was routine telemetry from spacecraft, faint cosmic noise, or signals from old satellites that had lost control. Yet, this particular signal was different. It was not random, it was deliberate, and it repeated itself in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The first team to notice it was a small group of analysts at a space observation center in Europe. They were reviewing nightly data as usual when a blinking indicator caught the eye of one of the junior technicians. At first, he thought it was a malfunction, a glitch in the system, perhaps caused by a temporary interference from solar activity. But as he studied the pattern, he realized it was structured. There was a sequence, a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. It wasn't just noise, it was a message. And not just any message, it was a distress signal. They quickly called in their supervisors. The room, which had been quiet and routine moments before, suddenly buzzed with tension. The more experienced analysts examined the data, cross-checking it with known sources and signals. Nothing in their databases matched what they were seeing. This signal was unique, coming from coordinates far beyond anything humanity had ever had contact with. No known satellite, spacecraft, or natural phenomenon could produce a pattern like this. Its origin was mysterious, and it was urgent. At first, there was disbelief. How could a real distress call come from such a place? Was it a hoax, a prank, or even some advanced form of interference from a foreign nation? Those thoughts raced through the minds of every expert in the room. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The SOS repeats at exact intervals, and the signal contains encoded information, coordinates, measurements, and repeated markers that indicated someone somewhere was in danger. The analysts realized, almost simultaneously, that ignoring it could be catastrophic. Word spread quickly but only quietly. The team contacted other monitoring stations in different continents. Soon, similar patterns were confirmed in Asia, North America, and Australia. Multiple independent teams detected the same signal. This was not a local anomaly. It was a global phenomenon. Governments were notified, but not publicly. There was no announcement on television, no press release. For the moment, it was a secret, shared only among the people who had the knowledge and the authority to act on one of the world capitals. A high-level meeting was convened. Military advisors, intelligence officers, space agency directors, and scientific experts gathered in a secure facility. The atmosphere was tense. Every person in the room understood the gravity of the situation, even if they did not yet know the full scale. Some suggested caution. Some argued for inaction until more evidence was gathered. Others insisted that a rapid response was necessary. No one could deny the possibility that this could be the first time humanity had encountered someone or something that was calling for help in a life-or-death situation beyond Earth. As they debated, the message continued to repeat. It was persistent. It seemed almost desperate. For hours, the teams analyzed every bit of information embedded in the signal. They discovered coordinates that led to a distant and desolate area of space, somewhere humanity had only explored in theory. There were other details as well, technical markers that suggested a civilization or organization was in distress, possibly under attack, and unable to defend itself. The tone of the message, if one could call it that, was urgent but structured, as if whoever sent it knew that help might be delayed. This realization changed everything. Governments began to weigh the risks. Responding to the SOS could expose humanity to unknown dangers. What if it was a trap? What if the signal was sent by an enemy with advanced technology, testing Earth's readiness? Every possibility was frightening. Yet there was another consideration. Ignoring the call could be morally unacceptable. Humanity had always prided itself on compassion, on responding to crises even when it involved risk. Now, there was a choice that was bigger than politics or strategy. This was a question of whether humanity could act when someone, somewhere, needed it the most. By the next day, a plan began to take shape. Analysts and military officials collaborated, running simulations and discussing potential responses. They realized that speed was critical. Whatever was happening at the source of the SOS, it was ongoing. Waiting too long could mean complete annihilation for whoever was calling for help. Meanwhile, scientists worked on decoding the signal further. They began to extract data that could help with navigation, possibly even hints about what kind of threat the sender was facing. Every detail mattered, because the unknown could be deadly. During this time, the signal itself began to have an unexpected psychological effect on those studying it. Some described a sense of urgency so profound that it was almost tangible. Analysts who had spent years studying space communications suddenly felt the weight of responsibility pressing on them. Every decision mattered. Every delay could be fatal. There were moments when the team collectively held their breath as they watched the signal pulse across their screens. It was a reminder that beyond the numbers and coordinates, there were lives that might depend entirely on humanity's willingness to act. As more data was gathered, the world leaders faced an unprecedented challenge. They had to consider deploying military resources, not to wage war, but to protect and rescue. It was a delicate balance. On one hand, they needed overwhelming force to ensure safety. On the other, they had to be careful not to provoke further danger. Plans were drawn in secret strategic mobilizations, rapid deployment protocols, and contingencies for worst-case scenarios. Even though no one had ever done anything like this before, the need for immediate action outweighed fear. Humanity was being called to step up, and there was no room for hesitation. The media, of course, knew nothing at this stage. There were no headlines, no social media buzz. The people who were aware of the signal were only those in the inner circles, tasked with understanding and responding. Rumors began to circulate among some circles, but official channels remained silent. The secrecy was necessary. Any public knowledge could cause panic or alert potential adversaries, complicating an already fragile situation. What stood out the most was the signal's consistency. It did not waver, it did not change, and it did not stop. Every attempt to ignore it, every suggestion to wait, was confronted by the harsh reality of its persistence. It was as if the signal itself demanded attention, insisting that humanity act, and in a way, that was exactly what it did. It forced the world to put aside minor differences, to focus entirely on the possibility of saving lives in a place beyond Earth, a place humanity had never had to reach before. By the end of the first week, the decision was made. Humanity would respond. The signal had done something remarkable. It had united governments, scientists, and military leaders around a single purpose. This was not about politics, territory, or resources. This was about survival and duty. Plans were moving forward to mobilize fleets, satellites, and support units. Every detail was being considered, from navigation to potential threats, from communication protocols to safety measures for human teams. It was clear that this was the beginning of something historic. And yet, even as preparations began, the analysts could not shake the sense of awe and fear. They were standing at the edge of the unknown. No one could say exactly what they would encounter. The distress signal had opened a door to a reality that was larger than anything humanity had faced before. It was a summons, an urgent call for help, and it demanded not just action, but courage, coordination, and a willingness to step into the unknown. For the first time in history, the world was preparing to respond to a real SOS from somewhere that humanity could barely imagine. It was quiet in the monitoring rooms late at night. The signal continued to pulse across screens, steady and unyielding. Each blink, each repeated sequence, reminded the teams of the lives at stake. The world had been alerted, and preparations were underway. Humanity's response had begun, not with weapons or fleets, but with awareness, understanding, and a shared sense of responsibility. That small, persistent signal had set in motion a chain of events that would change history, and for those who first heard it, there was no turning back. The world had realized something profound. When a desperate call for help comes from the unknown, humanity has no choice but to answer. The SOS had demanded attention, and the first step toward response had been taken. It was the start of a story that would challenge everything humanity thought it knew about courage, unity, and the reach of its power. The stage was set, the signal was still pulsing, and the unknown waited for humanity to arrive. Once the signal was confirmed as real, humanity had no choice but to act. The first step was coordination, something that had never been tested on this scale before. Normally, nations worked independently, with alliances and treaties guiding their decisions. But this was different. The SOS came from a place that no one fully understood, and the danger it hinted at was beyond imagination. Leaders realized that to respond effectively, they had to put aside old rivalries and disagreements. Borders, politics, and past conflicts suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the lives at stake on the other side of that signal. In government war rooms around the world, military officials and scientists worked side by side. Maps, satellite images, and simulation models covered the tables. Every fleet, every aircraft, and every satellite capable of reaching deep space or distant regions was catalogued, analyzed, and prepared for potential deployment. Naval fleets, including aircraft carriers, destroyers, and support vessels, were placed on high alert. Air forces prepared long-range reconnaissance and rapid response units. Even space agencies mobilized all available satellites, ensuring that every possible source of information could be used. It was an unprecedented mobilization. The challenge was enormous. Humanity had never faced a mission like this, where speed, scale, and precision all mattered simultaneously. The SOS had provided coordinates, but the nature of the threat was still unclear. Was it a natural disaster, a technological failure, or something more sinister, like an ongoing attack? Military planners had to prepare for every possible scenario, knowing that mistakes could be fatal. At the same time, they had to maintain caution, because an unknown force could be watching, waiting to see how humanity would respond. Training exercises and simulations began immediately. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen practiced coordinated maneuvers, rehearsing strategies for both defense and rescue. Intelligence officers studied the data for patterns that might hint at the kind of forces or challenges that awaited them. Scientists worked tirelessly to decode every aspect of the signal, hoping to understand the technology or language of those calling for help. The effort was monumental, but humanity's combined expertise and resources were unmatched. Every nation involved knew that this was no ordinary mission. It was an opportunity to define the future of human response to the unknown. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, communication networks were expanded and secured. Military channels, scientific forums, and emergency response lines were all connected in a single, coordinated network. Information could flow instantly between nations, ensuring that decisions could be made quickly and effectively. It was a delicate balance. Too much secrecy could slow down response, but too much exposure could lead to panic or exploitation. Strategists worked day and night to find the perfect balance, constantly refining plans as new information arrived from the signal. As preparations continued, equipment and technology were upgraded for the journey. Long-range spacecraft, reconnaissance drones, and advanced sensors were fitted with enhanced communication arrays. Naval vessels were stocked with emergency supplies, medical equipment, and advanced defensive systems. Every detail mattered, because once humanity crossed into the unknown, there would be no immediate backup. The fleets had to be self-sufficient, capable of sustaining themselves in hostile conditions for an indefinite period. The sheer scale of the mobilization was awe-inspiring. Ports were crowded with ships preparing to depart. Airfields were alive with planes taking off for tests and positioning, and satellites were reprogrammed to provide continuous coverage. Governments coordinated with private industries to ensure that every possible resource was available. Factories worked around the clock to produce components. Technicians labored tirelessly, and scientists analyzed streams of data that seemed endless. Humanity had committed its full weight to answering the call for help. Despite the urgency, there was a human side to this massive operation. Families of service members watched with anxious pride, knowing that their loved ones were being sent on a mission unlike anything ever attempted. Scientists and analysts experienced both fear and exhilaration, aware that their work could save countless lives, or fail in dramatic fashion. There were moments of doubt, but also moments of unity. People from different nations, cultures, and backgrounds worked together toward a single goal. For the first time, humanity was acting as one entity, focused on a purpose larger than politics or personal gain. As the fleets prepared to move, intelligence officers discovered troubling clues within the SOS signal. There were patterns that hinted at ongoing conflict at the source. Whatever was calling for help was not simply stranded, it was under attack. The details were limited, but enough to indicate urgency. The implications were clear. Humanity's mission would not be simple. This was not a rescue of survivors from a natural disaster. It was a response to a war that had already claimed lives and could continue to threaten anyone nearby. Strategies had to account for combat, defense, and rapid evacuation, all while maintaining the principle of protecting life. Command centers worked tirelessly to establish communication protocols. If there were survivors or entities at the coordinates, they needed a way to identify friendly forces. Teams created signal codes, encryption methods, and standardized procedures for contact. Every message sent would have to be precise, clear, and unambiguous. Miscommunication could result in disaster. Yet, amid the technical challenges, there was excitement. Humanity was on the brink of a historic event, responding to a real SOS from beyond Earth, acting as the first responders on a scale no one had ever imagined. Within weeks, the preparations reached their peak. Fleets were positioned strategically across oceans, ready to move at a moment's notice. Aircraft were prepared for long-range missions, reconnaissance drones were deployed, and satellites provided constant monitoring of the areas surrounding the signal's origin. Scientists provided continuous updates on the signal, adjusting navigational data as more information came in. Each passing hour brought humanity closer to the unknown, and each update intensified the sense of urgency and responsibility during this time. The psychological impact on those involved was profound. The mission's enormity weighed heavily on commanders, soldiers, and analysts alike. Yet, it also inspired an unprecedented sense of purpose. People who had never met worked together seamlessly, guided by the shared goal of answering a desperate call. It was a reminder that, despite differences and disagreements, humanity could unite in the face of danger. The signal had become a rallying point, a symbol of hope, and a test of collective courage. The final stages of preparation involved rehearsing possible encounters. Military teams ran drills, simulating attacks, blockades, and communication failures. Scientists worked to interpret potential environmental hazards or technological obstacles at the destination. Every hypothetical scenario was considered. The goal was to minimize surprises. But the truth was that the unknown could never be fully predicted. The crews were trained to adapt, improvise, and act decisively, because once they crossed into the area indicated by the they would have to rely on their skills, judgment, and teamwork more than any plan or protocol. When the day finally came to begin deployment, there was a mix of tension and anticipation. Fleets moved out of port, aircraft launched into the skies, and satellites shifted their orbits to provide optimal coverage. The coordinated effort was unlike anything the world had seen. News of the operation remained classified, but those involved understood the historical significance. Humanity was stepping into the unknown, responding to a call that no one had faced before. The stakes were high, but the resolve was stronger. Every person involved knew that their actions could save lives and define humanity's reputation on a global and even interstellar scale. As the Armada moved closer to the SOS coordinates, the reality of the mission became clearer. The signal's urgency had been justified. Whatever danger awaited, it was real, and it was immediate. Human forces were now fully committed, both morally and strategically. Each ship, plane, and satellite was part of a larger whole, functioning in a synchronized effort to reach those in need. The unknown stretched out ahead, but humanity's mobilization was unstoppable. Preparation had turned into action, and the world had shifted from waiting to responding, from uncertainty to determination. When faced with the unknown, humanity's strength lay not just in technology or firepower, but in its ability to unite, coordinate, and act decisively. The SOS had demanded attention, and humanity had answered. The fleets were on the move. The skies were full of reconnaissance aircraft, and satellites watched every corner of the Earth and beyond. The mission had begun, and there was no turning back. The response was in motion, and the world waited with bated breath to see what awaited at the distant coordinates of that desperate signal. It was clear that humanity was capable of rising above fear, politics, and uncertainty. The SOS had sparked a global mobilization, showcasing the collective courage, resourcefulness, and determination of the human race. Whatever lay ahead, the world was ready to face it. The Armada moved steadily forward, carrying with it the hopes, skills, and resolve of an entire species determined to answer a desperate call for help. As humanity's fleets moved closer to the coordinates of the SOS, the reality of the mission began to take shape. For weeks, scientists, military strategists, and analysts had studied the data, plotted the safest and fastest routes, and prepared for a range of unknown dangers. But nothing could fully prepare them for what they would see when they arrived. The area indicated by the SOS was not empty or calm. It was a war zone, and the scale of destruction was far beyond anything anyone had imagined. From hundreds of miles away, reconnaissance satellites first captured images of massive devastation. Entire regions appeared flattened, with the remnants of buildings, vehicles, and infrastructure scattered like broken toys. Fires burned in isolated pockets, and thick smoke obscured some areas entirely. It was clear that the SOS had come from a place already under extreme stress. Whoever had sent the message was in grave danger, and there was no time to waste. Military commanders understood immediately that the situation demanded both urgency and precision. The moment humanity entered this zone, there would be no second chance to correct mistakes. As the Armada approached, the first human eyes to witness the scene were those aboard the reconnaissance drones and satellites. The imagery showed not only physical devastation but also signs of ongoing conflict. Patterns of movement suggested organized forces, potentially hostile, operating in the area. Military strategists debated the best approach, whether to send in smaller advanced teams to assess threats or to deploy the entire Armada immediately. Every decision had enormous consequences, because hesitation could allow the attackers to regroup or escalate the conflict, and any misstep could endanger both human personnel and the people they were trying to save. The fleets moved cautiously, maintaining tight formations to maximize defense and coordination. Naval ships advanced slowly, scanning the waters and surrounding airspace for any sign of danger. Aircraft flew reconnaissance patterns to monitor enemy positions and potential hazards. Communication lines buzzed constantly as intelligence officers relayed information in relay time, updating commanders with the latest insights. The tension was palpable. Every person involved knew that they were entering a place where disaster was already unfolding, and every move had to be calculated carefully. When the Armada finally reached the heart of the SOS coordinates, the scale of destruction became undeniable. What was once an organized region, possibly a city or strategic location, now resembled a battlefield left in ruins. Structures were reduced to rubble, vehicles lay twisted and broken, and defensive installations had been destroyed or abandoned. Smoke, fire, and debris filled the air. The devastation was both physical and psychological. For the human teams witnessing it, there was a mixture of horror, urgency, and determination. They understood immediately that lives depended on their swift and coordinated action. The first survivors were discovered in makeshift shelters and partially intact buildings. They were traumatized, exhausted, and often injured. Many had been hiding for days, unsure whether anyone would come to help. When human forces arrived, the reactions were a mix of disbelief and relief. People who had almost given up hope suddenly saw a fleet of ships, aircraft, and personnel moving with purpose and coordination. The sheer scale of humanity's response was overwhelming, and for many of the survivors, it was almost impossible to believe that someone had actually come to help them. The emotional impact of the rescue was immediate and profound. As rescue operations began, the reality of the mission's complexity became clear. The area was not only dangerous but also unpredictable. Rogue elements, hostile forces, or unexploded ordnance posed constant threats. Human teams had to carefully establish secure perimeters while simultaneously organizing evacuation corridors. Medical personnel worked tirelessly, providing aid to those injured in the conflict. Engineers assessed structural damage, ensuring that temporary shelters were safe. Coordination between military, scientific, and humanitarian teams was critical, and every second counted. The Armada's presence had to be both protective and constructive, ensuring safety without provoking further chaos. While the rescue efforts were underway, reconnaissance data revealed that some hostile forces were still active. Small groups attempted to approach the human fleets, likely to test their strengths or disrupt operations. The commanders responded with controlled defensive measures, demonstrating overwhelming capability without unnecessarily escalating violence. Humanity's forces showed precision, coordination, and restraint, sending a clear message. The priority was to protect and rescue, but aggression would be met with decisive action. For the survivors observing this, the Armada was both a shield and a symbol of power and hope. Communication with the remaining inhabitants of the area became a priority. Specialists used advanced translation software and standard signal protocols to make contact. The goal was to ensure that people understood the intentions of the human forces. They were there to help, not to conquer or interfere. Gradually, more survivors came forward, guided by the security of the Armada and the clear organization of the response teams. The initial disbelief gave way to cautious cooperation, and the evacuation process began to take shape. It was painstaking, slow, and meticulous, but every life saved was a triumph. The human forces quickly realized that time was of the essence. The attackers who had caused the devastation were still present in the surrounding regions, and while they had not directly targeted the incoming Armada, their potential for violence could not be ignored. Military planners had to make constant adjustments to protect both their personnel and the people they were rescuing. This included dynamic defense positioning, rapid deployment of drones for surveillance, and continuous communication between ships, aircraft, and ground teams. Every action was deliberate, and every second counted. Despite the challenges, there were moments of hope and inspiration. Survivors began to share what had happened, stories of resilience, resourcefulness, and determination to survive. Children who had hidden for days were reunited with their families, and communities that had been scattered by conflict began to form temporary shelters together. The presence of human forces was more than just physical protection. It provided a psychological anchor, a symbol that someone cared enough to respond to their suffering. The Armada's efforts were not just about logistics, they were about restoring a sense of hope in the midst of chaos. As operations continued, the human teams began to gather intelligence about the nature of the conflict. They observed patterns of attack, remnants of defensive structures, and traces of advanced weaponry. It became evident that the situation had been far more dangerous than initially understood. Whoever had sent the SOS had been caught in a battle against forces that were technologically sophisticated, organized, and relentless. Yet, the human Armada's arrival shifted the balance immediately. The scale, coordination, and precision of their response created a clear advantage that the attackers had not anticipated. Over the following days, the Armada established control of key areas. Safe zones were designated for survivors, medical stations were set up, and evacuation routes were secured. The military presence provided both protection and confidence, allowing humanitarian teams to carry out their work efficiently. Communication lines were opened for the first time with those outside the affected area, enabling coordination of additional aid and logistical support. Humanity's forces were no longer just arriving, they were actively stabilizing the region, turning a chaotic battlefield into a structured, manageable environment. Human commanders emphasized restraint and discipline. Any engagement with remaining hostile forces was carefully calculated, with the primary goal of neutralizing threats without causing unnecessary harm. The focus remained on the rescue mission and the safety of civilians. This approach created a unique dynamic. While the attackers still existed in the surrounding areas, they were unable to disrupt the Armada's operations. Humanity's presence was a deterrent in itself, and survivors quickly recognized that the arriving forces were committed to their protection. The situation had reached a critical turning point. The Armada had successfully established safe zones, rescued large numbers of survivors, and demonstrated overwhelming capability against any remaining threats. Yet the mission was far from over. The rescue operation had revealed the full scale of the devastation and hinted at deeper dangers that might still exist beyond the visible areas. Human teams continued to monitor the region, ensuring that every life was accounted for and that security remained stable. This stage of the mission highlighted the extraordinary combination of technology, strategy, and human determination. Humanity had arrived in a war zone unlike any other and had managed to create order out of chaos. The SOS, which had initially been a faint and mysterious signal, had led to the deployment of forces capable of responding effectively to extreme danger. Lives were being saved, and hope was being restored. But the journey was only beginning. The Armada's presence would continue to shape the region, and every decision made now would influence the success of the mission in the days ahead. By the time the Armada prepared for the next phase of operations, it was clear that their arrival had changed everything. The survivors who had initially hidden in fear now looked toward the human forces as protectors and allies. The hostile forces, which had once dominated the area, had been temporarily neutralized or driven back. Humanity's mobilization had proven its effectiveness in both defense and rescue, demonstrating that coordination, discipline, and determination could overcome even the most challenging circumstances. The SOS had been answered, and the first tangible results of the mission were evident. The experience left an indelible mark on everyone involved. Commanders, soldiers, and scientists had seen firsthand the impact of rapid, organized action in the face of a desperate crisis. Survivors had experienced the relief and hope that came with a force capable of responding decisively, and the signal itself, which had seemed so small and distant at first, had become a catalyst for an unprecedented global effort. Humanity had entered the war zone, faced danger head-on, and begun the process of saving lives on a scale never attempted before. Courage, preparation, and unity could turn the tide even in the most extreme situations. Humanity had arrived where no one else had dared to go, and the consequences of their actions would resonate for years to come. The SOS had not only summoned help, it had revealed the true capability and resilience of the human race, ready to act when the stakes were highest and lives hung in the balance. As the human armada solidified its presence in the devastated region, the dynamics of the conflict began to shift dramatically. What had been a chaotic war zone, filled with fear, uncertainty, and scattered violence, was slowly transforming into a controlled environment under the careful watch of humanity's forces. Commanders knew that this was the turning point of the mission. The initial rescue and stabilization had succeeded, but the ultimate goal was not just to protect the survivors, it was to neutralize the remaining threats and ensure long-term security in the area. The first challenge was communication. Though the SOS signal had brought humanity to this distant location, the survivors and local forces still did not fully understand who had arrived and what their intentions were. It was essential to establish clear lines of contact and trust. Teams of linguists, scientists, and technical experts worked around the clock, using every method available to translate, decode, and transmit messages. They wanted to make sure that anyone still in hiding or anyone observing from afar knew exactly what humanity's forces represented. It was a delicate balance. Show enough strength to deter further aggression, but enough transparency to build trust and prevent panic. Once communication was established, humanity's armada began more proactive measures to stabilize the area. The hostile forces, realizing that the situation had changed, attempted to regroup, but they quickly found themselves outmatched. The armada had unmatched coordination, intelligence, and resources, and every move was calculated to protect civilians while neutralizing threats. Naval ships and aircraft created defensive perimeters, ensuring that any attempt to strike at the survivors or the human forces would be met with overwhelming response. Drones and reconnaissance units constantly monitored enemy movements, providing commanders with real-time data to plan precise interventions. It became increasingly clear that the arrival of humanity's forces had not just provided protection, it had shifted the balance of power entirely. The attackers, who had previously dominated the region, were now on the defensive. The strategic advantage lay with the human armada, which combined superior technology, disciplined coordination, and the moral clarity of a mission dedicated to saving lives. The psychological effect on the hostile forces was significant. Confusion, hesitation, and fear replaced the confidence they had held when the SOS first signaled the presence of imminent danger. Every calculated movement by the human forces reinforced the message: aggression would not succeed, and protection of the innocent was non-negotiable. Meanwhile, on the ground, the survivors were experiencing a remarkable transformation. Many had spent days or weeks hiding in fear, uncertain whether anyone would respond. Now, they saw organized teams moving with purpose, medical personnel tending to the injured, engineers securing shelters, and soldiers maintaining safety. The Armada's presence was more than just protection. It was hope in physical form. Families reunited, children emerged from hiding, and communities slowly began to organize themselves again under the guidance of the human teams. The combination of military precision and humanitarian care created a sense of stability that had been completely absent before. The turning point became more pronounced as humanity's forces began to take proactive measures to confront and neutralize remaining hostile elements. Small groups of attackers attempted to harass the human armada, but each attempt was met with precise, controlled responses. Non-lethal deterrents were used where possible, ensuring that civilian safety remained the priority. Commanders were careful to avoid overreaction while still demonstrating the immense capability of their forces. The effect was profound. Resistance crumbled not just physically but psychologically. Hostile groups realized that any attempt to continue the conflict would fail. Against such overwhelming coordination and preparedness, the technological advantage of humanity's armada played a critical role in this phase. Advanced sensors, satellite feeds, drones, and real-time communication allowed commanders to see every movement, anticipate every strategy, and respond before threats could escalate. The attackers had never faced anything like this. While they had relied on surprise and local knowledge, the human forces combined superior intelligence, rapid deployment, and ethical restraint to create an environment in which the attackers were no longer in control. Every strike, every patrol, every rescue operation reinforced the new reality. The balance of power had shifted, and humanity's armada now held it firmly at the same time. Efforts continued to reach out to the remaining survivors and any neutral parties in the area. Human teams established safe zones and communication hubs, where civilians could report their location, request aid, and receive reassurance. This created pockets of stability amidst the chaos, and these pockets gradually expanded as more areas were brought under secure control. The Armada's presence was both protective and transformative, providing immediate relief while laying the groundwork for longer-term recovery. For the first time in weeks, the survivors felt a sense of safety and possibility. The moral and psychological impact of the mission became increasingly evident. The attackers had initially assumed that humanity would be hesitant, uncoordinated, or unwilling to take risks for a distant signal. They had been wrong. Every maneuver of the Armada reinforced the perception of power combined with purpose. Survivors observed this and began to understand that help was not temporary or superficial. It was deliberate, overwhelming, and sustainable. The presence of humanity was no longer just a temporary intervention. It was a statement. Desperate calls for help would not be ignored. The culmination of these efforts led to decisive confrontations with the remaining hostile forces. As the attackers realized that conventional tactics could no longer succeed, they attempted to withdraw, regroup, or negotiate. Humanity's commanders allowed these options, as long as they did not threaten civilians. Evacuation corridors were established, and any non-compliant forces were contained or neutralized with precision. The result was a dramatic reversal. The attackers, who had held dominance over the area for weeks, were now retreating or surrendering, their control broken. The human armada had achieved what seemed impossible just days earlier, a full stabilization of a dangerous, war-torn region. The survivors, who had once feared for their lives at every step, now began to participate in rebuilding efforts. Human engineers worked alongside locals to establish safe shelters, temporary medical facilities, and supply distribution points. Communication networks were restored, allowing families separated by the conflict to reconnect. The SOS, which had initially been a single urgent plea, had catalyzed an unprecedented global response that combined military precision, humanitarian care, and scientific expertise. What had begun as a faint signal in deep space had led to a complete reversal of fortunes for those in the affected region. As the Armada continued its operations, the scale of the achievement became clear. Lives were being saved, communities stabilized, and the remnants of the hostile forces were either contained or neutralized. The mission demonstrated a rare combination of power and restraint, showing that military might could be used ethically and effectively to protect the innocent. The turning point had been reached, and humanity had proven that it could act decisively, intelligently, and compassionately even in the most extreme circumstances. Commanders and analysts began documenting every action, every decision, and every outcome. The lessons learned would not only serve the current mission but would inform future operations of similar scale. Humanity had faced an unknown threat, navigated a war zone, and achieved stabilization without causing unnecessary harm. The combination of technology, strategy, and ethical discipline had created a model for crisis response that was unprecedented in human history. The SOS had not just summoned help, it had catalyzed a demonstration of human capability and moral responsibility on a global scale. The balance of power had permanently shifted. The survivors had hope, the attackers had been neutralized or contained, and humanity's forces had demonstrated both capability and restraint. The turning point had been reached. The mission had moved from reaction to proactive control, from uncertainty to confidence, and from danger to stability. Humanity had not only answered a desperate call, it had redefined the possibilities of what coordinated global response we could achieve in a crisis that spanned beyond borders and involved unknown threats. This moment marked the climax of the Armada's initial mission. The remaining steps would focus on long-term protection, evacuation, and reconstruction. But the hardest and most decisive phase, the turning point in the war zone, was complete. The signal that had first been received as a faint SOS had now set in motion a sequence of events that demonstrated humanity's ability to face danger, act with purpose, and achieve remarkable outcomes even in the most unpredictable circumstances. The survivors who had once been terrified began to recognize the reality of their rescue. Children played under the watchful eyes of human forces, families reunited, and communities began to rebuild. The attackers had been deterred or removed, and the human armada had established an enduring presence that would prevent a resurgence of violence. The SOS, initially a simple plea for help, had triggered an extraordinary chain of events. Humanity had arrived, taken control, and ensured safety where none had existed. Courage, coordination, and ethical action could overcome even the most extreme dangers. Humanity had not only changed the immediate situation, it transformed the lives of countless individuals and created a legacy of hope and capability. The SOS had demanded an answer, and humanity had provided one that was decisive, intelligent, and compassionate. The turning point had been achieved, and the path forward now led to lasting stability and the promise of recovery for those who survived the unimaginable. After the decisive turning point, the human armada began focusing on the next critical phase of the mission, ensuring long-term safety, providing aid, and helping survivors rebuild their lives. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the region was still fragile. Debris littered the landscape, infrastructure was destroyed, and many survivors were traumatized by the violence they had endured. Humanity's forces understood that their mission could not end with mere protection. They had to leave behind a foundation for recovery, stability, and hope. The first priority was evacuation and resettlement. Human forces organized secure routes to relocate those still living in unsafe areas. Temporary shelters were established, complete with food, clean water, and medical support. Doctors, nurses, and field medics worked tirelessly to treat injuries, prevent the spread of disease, and provide care for children and the elderly. Psychological support teams were also deployed. Recognizing that trauma from conflict and destruction could be as dangerous as physical wounds, humanitarian aid became a crucial element of the mission. Alongside the military operations that had initially made it possible, communities began to cooperate with the Armada in ways that reflected both relief and gratitude. Survivors were encouraged to participate in reconstruction efforts, helping to rebuild homes, repair essential services, and restore basic functions. Engineers, construction specialists, and technicians guided these efforts, sharing knowledge and resources to accelerate recovery. The process was slow and challenging, but every small victory repaired well. A reconstructed shelter, a safe route through the city was celebrated. The survivors experienced, for the first time in weeks, a sense of normalcy returning to their lives. While reconstruction was underway, the human armada maintained a vigilant security presence. Even though the major hostile forces had been neutralized or dispersed, small pockets of resistance or opportunistic groups remained. The armada's ships, aircraft, and reconnaissance drones patrolled the area, ensuring that any potential threats were detected and neutralized quickly. Commanders emphasized restraint, avoiding unnecessary confrontation while guaranteeing that no group could disrupt the recovery process. This careful balance of strength and caution allowed communities to focus on rebuilding without fear. In addition to physical reconstruction, communication and education were restored. Schools were reopened in temporary structures. Community centers provided guidance and training, and survivors received updates on the status of the surrounding regions. Communication networks allowed separated families to reconnect and offered a way to coordinate the distribution of aid and resources. For many survivors, this was as critical as the rescue itself, helping them regain a sense of control over their lives after weeks of chaos and uncertainty. The presence of the Armada also created an opportunity for long-term strategic planning. Military and humanitarian teams collaborated with local leaders to assess future needs, identify vulnerabilities, and develop strategies to prevent similar disasters. They provided training, technology, and guidance, empowering communities to manage their own security and infrastructure in the months and years to come. This approach emphasized sustainability, ensuring that the impact of the human response would last beyond the immediate crisis. Human forces also worked to document every aspect of the mission. Detailed reports, maps, and logs were created to record the events, challenges, and successes. Scientists analyzed the data gathered from the SOS signal, the conflict zone, and ongoing reconnaissance to understand the scale and nature of the dangers that had been faced. Military strategists reviewed every operation, refining tactics and strategies for future missions. The documentation served both as a historical record and as a practical guide for responding to similar emergencies in the future. As stability returned, survivors began to express their gratitude in ways that transcended words. Children played freely in areas that had been war zones only days before. Families shared meals in newly rebuilt community spaces, and leaders of local groups participated in planning sessions alongside human forces. The contrast between the destruction they had endured and the recovery that was taking place was remarkable. For many, the presence of humanity's armada had not only saved lives but had restored faith in the possibility of survival, cooperation, and hope. Humanity's response also sent a broader message beyond the immediate region. While most of the world remained unaware of the full scale of the mission due to secrecy and security concerns, the lessons were significant. The SOS had proven that when a desperate call for help is received, humanity has the capacity, coordination, and moral clarity to respond decisively. The mission demonstrated that global cooperation, combined with advanced technology and ethical action, could overcome even the most extreme and unpredictable challenges. It was an example of what could be achieved when people, nations, and organizations worked together for a common purpose. In the weeks following the initial rescue and stabilization, the Armada began a careful withdrawal. Ships and aircraft gradually returned to Earth or to staging areas, leaving behind trained local teams and infrastructure that would continue to provide security and aid. The withdrawal was methodical and deliberate, ensuring that no gaps were left that could allow a resurgence of violence or chaos. Commanders coordinated closely with the remaining human personnel and local leaders to ensure a smooth transition, emphasizing that the mission was not complete until stability was fully self-sustaining. During this period, survivors began to share their experiences more openly. Stories of the initial attacks, the days of hiding, and the arrival of the human armada circulated within the communities. These narratives highlighted both the horrors they had endured and the extraordinary relief and hope that the armada had provided. Families recounted how small acts of care, treatment of an injury, provision of food, or guidance through dangerous areas had made the difference between life and death. Children described the awe of seeing massive ships and aircraft that had brought protection from the unknown. These accounts reinforced the impact of the mission, demonstrating that the response was not just strategic but deeply human. That as the final phases of withdrawal approached, the Armada also facilitated the transfer of knowledge and technology to local populations. Engineers and scientists trained locals in basic infrastructure repair, communication technologies, and emergency management. Military personnel shared strategies for maintaining security and organizing local defense in case of future threats. The survivors were not left helpless. They were empowered to take control of their communities and ensure ongoing safety. This focus on self-sufficiency was one of the most important aspects of the mission, ensuring that the benefits of the Armada's intervention would last long after the ships had departed. One of the most profound impacts of the mission was the change in perception it created among the survivors. For weeks, they had believed that help might never come, that the world beyond their immediate region was indifferent to their suffering. The arrival of the human armada shattered that belief. The survivors now understood that even in the face of overwhelming danger, humanity was capable of responding, protecting, and providing hope. This realization had a lasting effect, not only on individuals but on the collective mindset of the communities. Trust, resilience, and optimism began to replace fear, despair, and helplessness. In addition to immediate recovery efforts, the Armada also worked to secure long-term resources. Supply chains were established to ensure access to food, clean water, medicine, and other essentials. Temporary infrastructure, such as power generators, communication relays, and water purification systems, was put in place to stabilize the region until permanent solutions could be rebuilt. The scale of these operations was unprecedented, combining military precision with humanitarian care to achieve outcomes that were both immediate and sustainable. Finally, as the mission drew to a close, the Armada prepared to depart entirely, leaving behind trained personnel, secure facilities, and restored infrastructure. The survivors had experienced a transformation, from fear and desperation to safety, hope, and empowerment. The SOS that had initially called humanity into action had resulted in far more than a rescue. It had triggered a full-scale operation that combined protection, reconstruction, and moral responsibility. Lives had been saved, communities rebuilt, and lessons learned that would influence future generations. As the ships departed, there was a quiet recognition among the commanders and personnel that this mission had been historic. The SOS had summoned humanity into a place of extreme danger, and humanity had answered not with recklessness, but with strategy, compassion, and courage. The story of the Armada's response would remain classified for many, but the impact on the survivors and the region was undeniable. Humanity had proven that it could rise to any challenge, even when the call came from the most distant and desperate corners of existence. The mission's conclusion emphasized a profound truth, that courage, coordination, and empathy could change outcomes even in the most extreme situations. The survivors would carry the memory of the human armada for the rest of their lives, not just as saviors but as symbols of hope, resilience, and moral strength. And for humanity, the operation demonstrated that when a desperate SOS is sent, no matter how distant or impossible it seems, it will be met with action, protection, and unwavering determination. The region had been stabilized, survivors were safe, and the human forces had returned to Earth with valuable experience and data. The SOS had been answered fully, and humanity had left behind not just security and aid, but also a legacy of hope and the demonstration of what coordinated, ethical, and decisive action could achieve. Lives had been saved, communities rebuilt, and a reputation forged. Humanity was a force that would not ignore a call for help, no matter how desperate, distant, or dangerous.